Welcome to the Long Range Pursuit Podcast, presented by Gunwerks, where we learn about and share long-range shooting techniques, science, and gear.
Well, we're back on with another episode of Long Range Pursuit Podcast, and Instructor's Corner Edition. We got Jeremy and Brian here, a couple experts in the field.
Yeah,
allegedly.
Alleged, we'll find out, huh? But topic today, I think we want to talk a little bit about scope magnification. And, being on the marketing side, I run into a lot of questions along these lines very often. I'm sure you guys on the training side run into it quite a bit as well.
Yeah.
Now we're providing rifles for most of our classes, and so we give them a rifle that's what they shoot.
Yeah.
So they're not choosing their scope magnification. But I think there's some pros and cons and some things to consider. And I think there are some natural tendencies that maybe we could encourage people to learn to avoid.
Yeah. Some trends that we've been kind of, fed or whatever you want to call it in the industry, with, let's just say it, higher magnifications, right? Yeah. Maybe those in most shooting situations are maybe a hindrance as opposed to a positive, to make us actually perform better, especially in hunting situations. So,
right.
Yeah.
So I guess, one thing I thought maybe to kick things off, we don't have a sheet of paper here, but I was thinking what we ought to do is we ought to all write down our most ideal scope magnification and then compare notes without any comparison.
Yeah.
But
we could. I know
probably
mine.
all got a number in our head.
Yeah.
I have a feeling we might all be. Well, you might be an outlier.
I tend to always be a little bit different.
Yeah. You're a rebel,
I take it to
right?
the extreme,
Right.
But,
I'll throw my number out there. Yeah. At 3 to 18 range.
Yeah.
But having said that, the 18 power is only for seeing Mirage.
Okay.
I'd probably almost never shoot on 18 power.
Yeah.
But I'll turn it up to help see Mirage and see wind, but then immediately crank it down to my shooting power, which is probably in that 12 to 13 range,
right.
Depending on how much recoil I'm dealing with. The 6.5 Creedmoor, I might shoot a little bit more powerful.
Yeah.
A 30 Nosler, I'll probably shoot it at that 10 to 12 range because at the end of the day, I want to match my power with the amount of recoil I'm dealing with so that after I recover from recoil, that target is still in my field of view.
Yeah.
And that's really what determines, to a large degree, what's the highest magnification I would shoot at is when can I still see my target.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. And I think, I guess the caveat there is obviously there's no one size fits all, right? There are different applications, different rifles, different styles of shooting. Maybe you're shooting ELR steel versus hunting. I think, our mindset is always kind of hunting, right? What's
we tend to trend that way, right? Because we produce hunting rifles as opposed. We do some, the Verdict probably blends over more into that competition, long, old ELR.
But even
stuff.
if you look at it, we build one Verdict to 100 climbers and Magnuses.
Oh yeah, maybe
more than that. Yeah. But hunting is always the focus. Even in the training side, right? It's very hunting focused.
Yeah, absolutely.
Training. So
yeah.
Where you stand, Jeremy?
So the highest magnification I have on any one of my rifles, I have a little 6.5 Creedmoor, and it's got the 3 to 15, that Noob Racer LHT
that
on
Vortex,
there. Yep, the Vortex one. I believe we have that one on our track model, but I think
the track got the 4 to 20, which is awesome, and it's a first focal plane. The original 3 to 15,
which mine is a second. Yeah. But very nice package, right? Like it's it's something
awesome
really good glass. The tracking seems to be spot on. So, but on my main two hunting rifles, my 6.5 PRC and my 7 LRM, both those have 2.5 to 10 power scope on it, and so
you're on the pretty.
Most people look at it
long
and go,
range shooting goes.
How are you shooting that to 1,000, right? And when you do it, it's actually not that hard. 10 power at 1,000 is easy, pretty doable in most situations. And like Brian was saying, is you end up there anyway. So I just cut that out of the solution, right? It's like I probably can't see the Mirage as good anyway, but I have a spotter that I'm there with, or Mitch got me hooked on big power binos. So now I'm running 15s. And so, so now.
How do you find, can you pick up Mirage pretty good in the binos?
Oh yeah, it's so nice. Yeah, you just back that focus back just a little bit towards you, just like you would do in the spotter. Yeah. And actually the binos show it a lot better, just to be honest.
I think it's because both eyes are looking.
Yeah, both eyes are working.
And you probably get that binocular vision.
Contrast.
Right?
Yeah.
What do you call it? Like stereo vision or whatever, right?
Yeah, I almost want to say 3D, but I know that's not the term. But stereo vision, that makes more sense. But so I don't depend on it that much, in my shooting for seeing Mirage, because I depend on my binos and my spotter. But so I run a very low power, especially even in the hunting industry, with my main two hunting rifles, depending on where I'm going.
Yeah. And to your point, it's like if I think back to my time in the Marine Corps, we just ran fixed 10 power universals.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I had never shot more than 10 power, for years of my life, which is certainly sufficient for shooting 1,000 yards, right. And spotting your impacts. It gets a little tough out there. A little more power does help you see a splash a little bit better. But, and this is a little bit theoretical, but about the only other argument I can see for a bit higher power than Jeremy runs and maybe even than I run is when you're working in areas that have like minimum point requirements or minimum size requirements, sometimes it's a little bit hard to make that decision on, number one, which buck is which.
Sure.
And then that last minute decision on, is it legal or is it not legal? Sometimes a little more power and resolution just helps you make that decision right before you shoot.
That's a
little
good,
theoretical
good point. I mean, you'd hope you're verifying that through binoculars or spotting scope ahead of time, but it doesn't always work out that way. I mean,
something jumps out, happens pretty quick.
Yeah, you don't have time to pull that stuff out. So that's a good point.
Yeah, I know. Previously before I came back to instructing, I shot all the rifles here. I validated them, and I will say magnification there
for shooting
when
groups.
You're shooting groups.
Yeah, 100%.
25 power was really nice, right? Like the little 3D18s. You just lose that
right
little bit of resolution there. The dots are, it's floating inside there, but you crank that up to 25 power, and you can get that nice little quarter-minute dot that you're shooting at to be that. It looks like it's an inch big. It definitely helped me shooting groups. So I think there's definitely a plus on the actual maybe getting a 0 for a gun and verifying accuracy and some things like that, where that 2.5 to 10, I have to mind my P's and Q's. Like I have to really have a good day shooting to get to actually shoot groups out of it.
I mean, if I look back through some of my old logbooks from my police sniper rifles, though, I've got a whole bunch of third MOA groups, 100 yards, shot with a 3.5 to 10, old 3.5 to 10 Leopold. Yeah. And so it's like, I'm spoiled now. I want more than 10 power shooting groups at 100 yards. Yeah. But if I just look at some of the groups I've shot in my life,
it can be done.
It's
right?
needed.
Yeah. And you have to, I was probably the extreme side of it on, validating guns, wanting that more power, once once I validated my LRM and my 6.5 PRC,
you don't rather have a smaller scope.
Yeah, I'm not shooting groups anymore. You know what I mean? It's like, I very seldom go actually shoot a 7-shot group just to see if my accuracy's still there, because my round count's really low. I'm not seeing any problems downrange with data or anything. No. So, the gun's still performing well. So I don't need to go back and verify that it's going to shoot a sub, whatever 7-shot group.
It does.
I know it does, right? So, I'll put 2 or 3 down there to check a 0 every now and then, but I'm not shooting a group with it. And so then I don't need that, 25 power at that range. And the other thing is, I should say, I built a little bit different rifles than most guys. I'm pretty minimal. Like, my longest barrel's 18. Sure. And my standard barrels are 16, my PRC, and, they're 16-inch barrels. I'm building a very small, very compact, rifles, right?
Little backcountry gun.
And so the benefit with that 15 and that 10 power scope on there, I believe the LHT is 13 inches long, and the little 2.5 to 10 is 12 inches long. Oh, yeah. Like, it just makes this nice little small package, right? Uh-huh. And it's only a 42.
You don't want a big top-heavy gun with a heavy scope on it.
Yeah, only a 42 millimeter objective, so I can run a low set of rings, so I don't have to make any accommodations for my cheek piece or anything like that. I can reduce any extra hardware that I need to. And so I'm able to build this nice little short gun that goes in my pack. I don't notice it all day, and then I take it out to shoot it, right? Yeah. That being said, that little gun, it's very hard to shoot, just from the fundamental standpoint at 11 or 1,200 yards. So, I'm giving up. I'm okay with giving up some of that, that LRM, it's a 1,400 yard gun if you wanted it to be. I'm giving up some of that, to have this little small package. So, that's why I chose those scopes, because they were minimal, and it allowed me to continue the build that I was trying to achieve. If I had tried to put a 5 to 25 on there, I probably could have got away with the 3-18. That little Mark 5 3-18. It's pretty short,
compact,
a little bigger scope tube
light
than I probably need, but it's compact. It's not too bad. I probably could have got away with that.
Yeah.
But that that 2.5 to 10, that 3 to 15 was just that next little size smaller. That I thought fit my system. So I think it depends on what a guy's trying to achieve. Obviously, right? That 3-18 on a Magnus is
awesome.
Yeah, it is hard to beat that combination.
Yeah.
I know a lot of guys they think that Magnus is more of a competition bigger gun, but if you don't hardware it up, I mean it's right there where 8.5, 9
still
pounds.
Packable, right?
It's way packable,
throw
right?
titanium on there, keep the barrel weight, barrel length a little shorter, and it's
a much more stable platform to shoot than the Climber as well. The Climber's so minimal. We lose some of that shootability by having that smaller grip and the narrower forend, and not as big a cheek weld on there. You lose some of that shootability. So usually if a guy asks me, unless they're doing some really serious like ultra lightweight backcountry hunting, I'll push them to let's just do a short barreled, minimal Magnus, with that 3-18.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty hard combo to beat, you know what I mean? When it comes right down to it.
Yeah, right with you on that. I mean, I guess coming from 14-pound sniper rifles, if I pick up a 10-pound one, I'm like, oh, this thing's pretty light.
Nice.
I mean, so I've never really gone too far down the lightweight, rabbit hole.
Sure.
But I'm right with you. I mean, you build a Magnus that ends up around 9 pounds. I mean, it's shootable. It has enough scope power for what you need.
Yeah.
And it's just you want the scope, just like you were talking about with your really lightweight stuff. You want the scope to complement the rifle.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of rifles that are really overscoped.
Yeah.
I mean, if I see a 30 nozzle with a 5 to 25 on it, it's like that thing is not shootable at 25 power.
Yeah.
I think that's my main point here is that you just see so many guys. I bet you if you looked at the different scope ranges, especially in the long range space, that 5 to 25 range is probably one of the more popular.
Yeah, it's probably 80% of the market, isn't
it?
Yeah.
And I bet you 89% of those guys don't need a 5 to 25.
Yeah.
They need a 3 to 15, or
3 to 18,
or maybe like a 4 to 20, like that old G7 scope that we ran for a long time was a 4.5 to 22. Like that was a little bit on the higher end, but I really like that 3 to 8. I mean, that was my numbers, that 3 to 18 number. Yeah. Just a little bit extra for shooting groups. I do a lot of tinkering, so I'm always playing with loads.
Okay.
So I can't just force myself to shoot a rifle, get a load dialed, and then just put it on the shelf. I'm always playing with it. So I'm always shooting groups. And so I do see sometimes it helpful to have a little bit of that higher end. Yeah. But I definitely don't see. I think you're doing yourself more harm than good trying to shoot animals at 25 magnification on a rifle.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, especially in the early season, right? The Mirage just kills you. You get above, we used to say, it's probably pretty true that you hit that 20 power mark, and then above that becomes pretty unusable once you hit 80 degrees, so it's like anything over 80 degrees, you're going to be down. You're going to have to turn the magnification down to eliminate some of that visual mirage so that you can shoot through the conditions anyway, and so, that kind of used to be the benchmark, and that's why that 3 to 18 kind of fits nice in there. You could be on max power and still, it's still usable, right?
Yeah.
At 18 power, you can see through the Mirage and you can run it there.
Yeah.
On our school guns, we have that 5 to 25 Mark 5 on there, and we constantly are pushing guys to shoot the lowest magnification
Back it off,
that you can get away with, right? When we're at 100 yards, awesome. You want to shoot 25 power and shoot tiny little bug hole groups, that's awesome. But when you're shooting a 1/2 minute plate at 900 yards, and in our school we really push that follow-up shot, right? Because it's all about that, getting that second shot downrange as quick as possible.
Your impact
and seeing your own impact, right? That's not going to happen at 25 power because your field of view gets so small, at that 25 power. So guys are, like Brian was saying, they're running 14, 13, 15 power, 10 power, they end up cranking it way down just so that they can get that big field of view so that they can return that gun to battery and see the target right there and re-engage it, as quick as possible.
And it might vary. I mean, say maybe you're shooting a 2250 or a 6 Creedmoor or something like that.
That doesn't move.
Like there's almost no movement, especially if you're shooting it braked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like maybe you are justified shooting it a little bit higher magnification. But most of these big Magnum hunting rounds, these big game rounds that we're shooting, you've, especially if you're running a suppressor on there, right?
Yeah.
You're increasing that recoil impulse a little bit versus a brake. You've got to be backing that out to watch that.
Yeah, if we're I think that's a whole nother topic, right? The caliber we choose. Like we could probably say a lot of the same things. It's like I think a lot of guys over caliber as well.
Over caliber.
We'll save that for a different discussion. Right. But because of that, we're seeing just going back to when I was shooting guns, right? When the first the 6.5 PRC came out, it got really popular really fast, and there was a time frame where that was the majority of our builds.
Mm-hmm. I bet it's still the most popular. Wouldn't you say?
I think the 28.
I think 28 is,
the last couple years,
those two have been pretty neck and neck.
Yeah, the last couple years I shot, it kind of seemed that the trend was the 28, and in the short action, it kind of went to the 7 SAUM.
Yeah, that's
which
true.
in a little short action climber probably acts very similar to a Magnus 28, right? Sure. Like in movement. Yeah. And so I saw this shift. I think a lot of guys are shooting the big heavier Magnums, and then they always end up with a 5-25 or a, what's the Collies? It's 5-25 as well.
Yeah.
Yep. And the PMR, the original PMR was 4.5-27 or something like that. Had a big power range as well.
Yeah.
And so you saw a lot of that, I thought. Just because of that rifle's movement, I think most guys probably ended up shooting at least a third of the way down, right? So they're in the 20s for sure, low 20s. And it's like, what you could have saved. I mean, I'm not sure what the difference is between the 5.25 and 3.18. Is it quite half a pound? Maybe close to half a pound, we'll say. I don't think it's quite half a pound. I think it's
but certainly a lot of
6 ounces. Yeah, it's enough that you notice a difference, right?
And sometimes the perception of weight comes from bulk too.
Yeah.
And just how unwieldy it seems.
Yeah, how long it is.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's definitely even if it's not much heavier, it's just a bigger package and it feels heavier.
Yeah.
And,
it's definitely harder to pull a scope code on and off a 5-25. That's 3 I mean, when you start talking about the little things, right? You got to peel that scope code off to make a shot. If it's a hurried shot, there might be something to be said to those little shorter ones.
And speaking of time crunch stuff, like a lot of the scenarios we're running, especially in level 3.
Yeah.
It's like, stuff's a little bit hard to find. A lot of those targets are hard to find, and a lot of what we'll see, under time pressure, which is very consistent with hunting because it's very often there's some time pressure there, is guys will crank that power down to get a big field of view to find it, but then spend another 30 seconds cranking the power back up. And I always say it's like shoot at the lowest magnification that you can see your wind holds.
Sure.
So whatever power that is in your scope where you can really discern, those wind holds.
Yeah.
And it's just you kind of turn it back up to you. It feels right. And oftentimes I don't really know what power I'm actually shooting at. And I went out antelope hunting a few days ago, and it was only about a 400-yard shot, but they're a little hard to see in there, so I turned the power down, found them, turned the power back up till it looked right, shot, dropped them, and then just almost out of curiosity, I was like, hey, I wonder what power I was at. I was at 8 power.
Nice.
Yeah.
And that's what looked right,
Yeah.
And I held a minute of wind on them.
Yeah. I find the same thing. It's like that little 2.5 to 10.
Yeah.
It's like I very seldom have to pull it off of that, right?
Yeah.
Like it's up there every now and then. Maybe for my daughter or something, I'll crank it way down, give her the biggest field of view, just so she can find it or whatever. But for me, it's like I hardly ever bring it off max power, and then for me that's nice because I just don't have to. It's one less thing for me to worry about, right? It's like one less thing that I have to do.
Yeah.
If I can't shoot in that condition, then it's probably not shootable anyway.
Yeah.
So I just have to find something different.
But
it definitely, it's tied to a couple different things, right? The use, what you're doing, right? The what you're gonna do with the rifle, and then I think that the size of that rifle package, should dictate a lot of those, those power choices.
Sure.
But
and then a lot of my background comes from either tactical or kind of defensive use. So I tend to look at that lowest power range.
It's important.
Because I spent you know, it's kind of different here. When I was growing up in Alaska, we never carried pistols.
Yeah.
You know, so the rifle we carried was your bear defense.
Oh, okay.
You know, so you always just made it a habit of, you know, 3 to 4 on the low end was always the max that you'd want, because it was just unusable at 15 yards if it was more power than that. So you always made it a habit of, you know, carrying around, you'd crank that power all the way down.
Yeah.
You know, so I still have that habit. And the same thing on the tactical side. It's like we might have had a 3 to 15 power scope, but we'd always deploy at 3 power because that's your quick stuff. And if you need the higher power, you have time to switch it to the higher power.
Crank it up.
It's kind of the mentality, you know. But 5 is getting into that. I mean, if you're working in grizzly country, you know, like
when
I said,
you pull it up and just see fur, right?
Yeah.
You
know, and although I've kind of gotten the habit now where it's less important now, because I've kind of gotten in a habit now, because I think so much of the bear stuff happens here so close and so fast.
Yeah.
You know, that I just carry a pistol and don't really worry about using the rifle.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, same.
But you know, there's still instances if you're hunting really thick terrain where you very well may be jump shooting stuff, right? I mean, maybe you're stretching some shots out, but there's still instances, you know, guys that do a lot of still hunting kind of stuff. You know, I think out here west, my hunting style is not that conducive to that. You know, I say that and then I just jump shot a bison at 25 yards. But you know, generally I find my shots, you know, 99% of my shots from 200 to 500 yards or something like that, you know. But some of the guys, if your hunting style or where you hunt is conducive to some close up quick shots needed, whether that's the game you're hunting or whether it's a defensive situation or dangerous game or something like that, then you definitely need to be thinking about a lower magnification. And you know, even on that 3 end,
that's a little high.
It might be a little high. You know, you see some of these low power variable optics becoming really popular in the industry. You know, these 1-8s and 1-10s even. Where you can have basically a natural, you know, 1 power scope, which you know, for really quick offhand shooting, I think is ideal, right? Then you're both eyes open kind of stuff.
Well, because I actually used to run a 1-6 on basically an entry gun on the law enforcement side. You know, and I found that you shoot a 1-6 power scope on 1 power with both eyes open. I didn't give up any time.
Exactly.
Or if I did, it was fractional. Versus running the same gun with a red dot sight on it.
Right.
You know, and so, you know, I always used to tell people, it's like, you know, and this is completely on the law enforcement side. It's like, you know, that you might deploy like an AR platform out to 50 or 100 yards. It's like, I don't need 6 power to hit somebody at 100 yards. I need 6 power to see if he's armed or not. You know, and so just that resolution, that ability, if you need it, to just bring it closer and really see what you got, you know, was pretty critical.
Interesting.
You know, and there's a couple of situations where standing next to somebody with a red dot, either I could see that someone did or did not have a gun, so there was no question in my mind which it was. You know, or see a gun when the guy with the red dot couldn't.
You know.
Interesting.
Well, I think that's where that zoom ratio, you know,
is huge.
And we're lucky, right? You know, with these where the trend in the industry is going to first focal plane, right? We're seeing less second, but there's still few out there, but we're seeing this trend of first focal plane, right? So we're starting to see these bigger zoom ratios, which is nice because now I can get a 1-10. I get a 10 power zoom ratio, right? And which is
huge,
which is awesome, right? Like that little 2.5 to 10 of mine would be even better at 1
versus
to 10.
the old 3 to 9, right? Which has been the standard for decades.
Right? And so there's some downside to those big ones, right? But it's like, I think it does give an optic a lot more usability, especially where Brian was saying, and you were saying the up close, you know, the still hunting, where you can get down into the 1s and 2s and low 3s on the bottom end and still have high end, you know, an 18 or a 20 or even maybe even higher on the top end. And so it becomes more of a little, let's say, universal usage.
Typically going to add some weight because I think, you know, I'm not an optomechanical engineer or whatever those, you know, we got a couple of those guys on staff, but you know, you're stacking lenses in there to be able to expand that zoom ratio. And so typically those scopes get a little bit heavier. They can still be pretty compact. But that is
you know, and usually your first focal plane is going to be combined with an illumination as well. So that adds a little bit, you know, some weight and cost. Which, you know, you want, right? When anybody has turned a first focal plane, even a higher zoom ratio, let's say a 5 to 25, at 5, you turn it all the way down on the bottom. 5's pretty hard to see you know, anything discernible. And that's why the illumination's nice. It, you know, it illuminates it up and you at least have an aim point at the lowest power, right? And that kind of segues into, what choices are guys making with reticles. I think that's where Aaron did a really nice job on what's our hunting one? I believe it's RH1 is our hunting one that we see in the 5 to 25 and the 3 to 18 Leupold.
Yeah.
When you crank that all the way down, the middle disappears. Actually, you can't see an aim point there. But what
post?
Yeah, what shows up is this big European style post, and you just shoot it like the front post of a pistol, right? Yeah. You just you stack the target on top of that post, and it's a big post, like it's almost annoyingly big. I'd say annoyingly big, but because it becomes very broad in your view. And so there's one from the bottom and there's two from the sides, and they're so big in black that even on lowest power, you can just center up whatever you're shooting at, right? Well,
and the thing is that the concept is that you don't have to think about it. It's just your mind naturally centers up your target. And here's a perfect example, right? I just shot a bison a week and a half ago at 25 yards, like offhand, really quick. And I'm shooting a prototype scope. And I had, I'm walking around with that thing backed all the way off, right? Yeah. More to come. But, and a prototype reticle. And so, talking about it with the team when I got back, someone asked, well, what power did you shoot at?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't think about it. I just was bottomed all the way out naturally. That's just how I always carry my scopes.
Yeah.
So I pull up, shoot. Well, that's a first focal plane scope. So you think about it, you cannot see the reticle at all at that range.
Yeah.
And it never dawned on me that I just naturally used those posts in that scope and centered it up and shot.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a perfect testimonial that it worked because I didn't have to think about it.
Yeah.
And it didn't even dawn on me until retrospect a couple days later. Someone asked me, like, wait a second, that it did its job.
Yeah.
So a lot of guys beat us up over that, a little bit. It's like, why do you have why are those big things in there? And it's like, well, there is a purpose, right? Yeah. Like,
and they disappear with the first focal plane scope.
Yeah, you crank it up,
completely out of
they
view.
Move out of your picture view. The big one's still kind of at the bottom, but it's like they move out so much that they're clear out of what you're looking at in the center of the scope anyway. Yeah. Yeah, and so not to brag too much on us, but that RH1, I hope that reticle doesn't go away. I really like that reticle for that reason. Yeah. It's like even on the super low, because there's some out there in the industry, right? You turn them all the way down and you can't see anything. Even illuminated, you can see that there's something there, but it's still kind of hard to pick an aim point.
Yeah. And then you're dependent upon that illumination.
Yeah, you're depending on it. So here's another step that I have to do in order to use it. Yeah. And so I really like that reticle, even though guys are like a little annoyed by how big those are in there at times, but it's like, man, there is a use for them. Mm-hmm. And like you said, the proof's in the pudding, right? You didn't have to think about it. That's what they're meant to do, right? Exactly. Just like you're in, Brian probably knows shooting pistols way more than I do. It's like you probably don't even look at your rear sight. Do you look at your rear sight anymore, or you just push it out and that front sight's where it needs to be?
You're kind of aware of it, but you're not focused on it.
Yeah. And that's kind of the, to me, that's the I equate them the same because that's how I shoot them the same. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but that's kind of how I shoot my pistol with the front sight, and that equates to that, where I've had occasion where I turned it all the way down and made shots at, I shot an antelope really close. I mean, it was like 25 yards. Yeah. And it was just a matter of finding the little aim point on the antelope, right? The little L-shaped tan spot there. And I just found that in those big posts, and I just sent it right there, and it worked really well that way.
Just coming back from Alaska, I used the Leupold.
Oh yeah.
3 to 18, that has the reticle we're talking about in it, which, I'm completely with you. I really like that reticle.
Yeah.
And I never ended up, but it's always dark and gloomy. It's like it's rainy. It's just always kind of dark and gloomy. It was to the point where I was running the rangefinder, 2 brightness settings lower than I just carry it around here at. Yeah. Because it's just dark.
Yeah.
And I'd crank that Leupold down to about 3.5 or 4 power. And it gets small, but they just naturally guide your eye to the center. Mm-hmm. And so even though you can't see that center crosshair, your mind knows where it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, and you don't have to see it. You just have to know where it is.
Yeah.
And it's instinctive. And I could, just in those dark conditions, I was just kind of playing with it. Obviously I didn't have to shoot in those dark conditions. Yeah. But if that bear had waited another hour to come out, I'd have been shooting in a little bit of dark, and I'd have been using that.
Yeah. Aaron, if you're listening, let's keep the RH1 or some version of it, please.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he knows my thoughts on it.
Yeah, because we do. We got lots more optics coming out, pretty soon here that I've got to peek at here and there. And I would imagine there's going to be some reticle changes. So, because we try to always innovate. But I would imagine that
there'll be some changes, but I think a lot of the elements are going to stay the same, the successful pieces.
I actually think we're improving on that concept from what I've seen.
Yeah.
Couple of little refinements there.
Good. Yeah. That, it all comes back to that, the power, right? It's like, what are you going to choose to hunt with? And I think, everybody in here, max is 18, right? Yep. And so I think, with the success that everybody's had in this room, hunting, over the last few years, I don't think you can discount that you can run a lower scope and be successful, right? Like we've all had lots of success. I don't think I've ever failed because I couldn't turn it to 25. And so I think that there's a lot to be said about, running a lower power than you think you need.
Yeah. I think my takeaway is if you're thinking you need a 25 to 25 on your next gun, think about maybe a 3 to 18.
Yeah.
If you're thinking you need a 7 to 35 on your next gun, definitely
think about the 5 to 25 or 3 to 18.
Or preferably the 3 to 18, but maybe the 5 to 25.
If you're really a hunter, if you're looking at a 7 to 35.
Yeah. And like I say, there are exceptions. If you're a 1,000-yard bench rest shooter, if you're trying to shoot coos deer at 900 yards, maybe there's some exceptions there, but just give that some thought when you're doing your next build for sure.
Yeah.
I think that's my
I guess I think a lot of our clients, we certainly have clients that, have the wherewithal that they can have kind of the one of each.
Yeah.
But I kind of look at our guns as being, I recommend, when someone asks about a gun, I look at it as like, I'm recommending the quiver killer for this guy.
Yeah.
This supposed to replace a couple other guns.
Yeah.
So I want that gun to be 1,000-yard capable. But like we said, I also want it to be 25-yard capable. I don't want to get so locked into the long range thing that he doesn't have the ability to just jump shoot something.
Yeah.
And so if I look at the tool that is going to cover the biggest gamut of possible scenarios, somewhere with your 2.5 to 10 on the low side and the 3 to 18 on the high side.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there, I think is just that ideal range.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for jumping on today, guys.
That was a good little discussion, wasn't it?
Cool. All right. All good. Perfect.
If you like what you're hearing here, please take a second and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. We appreciate your feedback and suggestions for topics you'd like discussed or questions you want answered on the podcast. You can reach out on Facebook or Instagram or send us an email to podcast@gunwerks.com. Also, be sure and check out our full offering of long-range gear at gunwerks.com. Use promo code LRP for free shipping on any order.